This is Generous Theology, and for this episode, Chuck and Brock are taking a look at Chapter 20, The Nature of Change, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
I agree. I think one of the key kernels out of this was that whole idea of teleos, of direction. And really, that issue gets at, and yeah, I realize that when you divide it into sort of two, you're probably we're probably being a little too simplistic, but yeah, it makes some sense. And I thought one key set of sentences in Tyson's chapter here, 284, right at the end of the section on the Aristotelian definition, he puts it very clearly. He says Aquinas and even more explicitly Buridan read into Aristotle's definition that change is a process that strives at fulfillment in that it is ordered toward an ulterior actuality. And we know Aquinas and Buridan seem to be, they were accepting of Aristotelian ways of thinking, but they also very much, and they wanted to synthesize or whether they want to correct Aristotle's thinking to deal with the revelation that we have from Scripture. I think it's very clear in Scripture that there is a direction. And so their philosophy went there. And whereas then the next sentence, Occam, in a way, takes the same lead, but he interprets it in purely temporal terms. An object in change has already acquired something that it did not have before, and it will acquire something else immediately afterwards that it yet lacks. And he really does try to come up with a much more temporal or non-transcendental, empirical, maybe to use later terms, way of thinking through things. And while Occam was no modern secularist, you see some of the seeds of that in at least in that little piece of it. And I found that to be really interesting.
I love that explanation. Something that struck me reading this chapter is the idea of I'm searching for the right word here. The idea of if there were a complement, if there were a secular Bible, let's say, for lack of a better word, it would roughly be, and let me recapitulate and rephrase this. That's the right term. If the history of the Jewish people in the early Christian church, which accompanies maybe the 1500 years or so of God's divine revelation in the Old and New Testaments, if that represents the core of what the age of faith was and what sort of the religious or the divine revelation school is really all about. And of course, this is from a Christian-centric purpose. There are non-Christian theistic religions that aren't covered by this. But the point is you have this corpus that's gathered in a text that really is seen to be the crown jewels of antiquity. And I think we could put the works of Plato and Aristotle and the Greek corpus that eventually turns into classical theism. I think we can put that not quite into a Bible for the secular camp, for the secular side, but we can put it into documents of extreme importance. And the difficulties with Aristotle, we say this loosely because, as you can see, reading the development in the centuries of thought, what Aristotelianism develops to such a degree that there are times when I wonder if it's fair to still call it an Aristotelianism. And yet, that still is underneath it. And I wonder if the transition in the Renaissance to modernity, and culminating in the thesis, synthesis, antithesis of the German idealistic period, Hegel in particular, more broadly to that theme, I wonder if that is largely that dialectic step is largely a recognition that Aristotle got something proximately close for his time, and yet over the centuries, Aristotelianism just maybe fell apart, and the actual sort of categories he uses, the fourfold causality, some of his other principles, just at a metaphysics level fall apart, and you can no longer hold the fabric together at some point. And I think you have the introduction of this synthetic step to deal with that. And Chuck, if you and I are wearing clothes, and we wear those clothes for a long time, after a while we have to start patching them, and then after a while we have to start patching the patches, and then after a while the whole thing, we've patched the patches for 5 or 6 successive generations. And after a while, it becomes very difficult for that to hold together. And yet, at the same point in time, it still remains a starting point for our wardrobe, if that makes sense. And I see the secular camp and its development in modernity of the dialectic as maybe a step toward refreshing that. So maintaining the history, maintaining the tradition, while yet maintaining some of the ideas about things like the theory of everything, the commitment to uniformitarianism, the commitment to the eternality, commitment to what would later become the central ideas of evolution. That is to say, a teleos-less, purposeless, impersonal time and space moving through random motions, interactions of impersonal objects. And I just wonder if this dialectic is a response to that. And that was a whole lot to say, and I'm not sure how specific I got with it to justify that. But that was something that I read here, or that came to my mind when I was reading in the chapter here. And I just wanted to throw it out there. It's a big ball of mess, but make of it of what you will. But this is something that worldviews have to deal with as you go through the centuries. And the Christian worldview has had to deal with it to some degree, but I think the underlying text, you look at the biblical account, I think it still holds. Even 2,000, 3,000 years later, it still holds for some measure of hold. And I'll agree that's controversial, but having put all that in your lap, Chuck, what would you do with that?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really interesting is first of all, I think you've analyzed it correctly, that there's a sense in which we're putting patches upon patches, and there may be even a sense that there is no remaining cloth from the original Aristotle, but there is still shape, right? It's a shirt, it's trousers, or whatever it is, even if it's a wholly different cloth. I think that's one good way of thinking about it. I think the other thing that's interesting in all of that is I realize this idea of the dialectic really becomes stronger in modernity and really becomes a real. Kant obviously uses that idea, as do later people who come after Kant. But it is interesting that there is a sense in which, for example, on the one hand, we agree with Aquinas on this issue of direction, right? In this issue of telos. And yet there is also a sense in which we sometimes, I think, are a little concerned with Aquinas, that at times in synthesizing things together, in doing some of that dialectical dialogue, the back and forth, that he allowed ideas that may have led to some of the directions that we see today that we don't necessarily agree with come in. On the other hand, I think there's also a sense in which, while we may disagree with some of Aquinas's conclusions on things and are concerned about where they go, there's a sense in which that process is a valid process as long as you still have truth at the heart of it. And so it strikes me, and that I came into this a little bit, I had always grown up hearing Aquinas as the boogeyman a little bit because of some of Aquinas's ideas on the ability of human intellect and reason to maybe be less impacted by sin than the reformers would agree with. But there's also a sense in which that struggle of what he did is entirely appropriate, given that we have been given two forms of revelation from God in the written scripture, the direct revelation, and sort of the more general revelation of the world around us. And I think it is true that we don't want to sort of throw one or the other out. And the moderates have thrown out scripture, or for the most part, or at least turned it into something with very little meaning. But we also have to be careful not to throw out general revelation either, as long as we understand what it is, what its purpose is, and that general revelation is still a revelation of God, and therefore there's not going to be, when we perceive, it seems to us sinful humans, to be discontinuities between general and special revelation, we still have to understand that special revelation is God's special revelation, and consider that quite strongly, and that's not what God. And all this is a formless mess too, but it's really all just a way of saying, wow, it's really interesting interesting to see this process and where this process has led, and to see how there's a lot of good that was in this process. There's a lot of stuff that we, aren't probably real happy with where things went. It could have gone in many other directions that would have been negative as well. And perhaps, just perhaps, the fact that even if we don't have the same cloth anymore that we once had, that there are still some shapes that remain, still have the trousers, still have the shirt. There may be some sense in which that preservation of that shape is something that we as Christians still point to and rely on in working to once again get our perspectives considered within the halls of academia. I think there's a sense in which that's what people like Alvin Plantinga have done, and that's why there's perhaps a sense in which Christians and theists at least haven't been completely tossed out. Maybe they've been marginalized, but they haven't been completely tossed out, because there's been the recognition of smart people like that, there are still some patterns here that carry through. Perhaps part of our goal, even in the study that we're doing, is to look for some of those patterns and look for where, even in the directions that modernity has gone that we would disagree with, that we can pull back to some of the patterns. Almost feel like we're starting to talk about forms, Plato's forms and things, but that's not what I mean by that. But there is a sense that we may still have something to grab onto. Aristotle and Greek thought may be a way to help us explain some of those things, even among moderns today.